Hey there, welcome back to season 7 of the Product to Product podcast. My name is Latif Nanji and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Roadmunk. This season, we're going to explore product sense, what it is and how it fits into your development lifecycle, and how you can get better at it. We'll have PMs share tactical advice as well as their successes and lessons learned. Today, my guest is Frank Ramirez of Webflow, where he's the head of product development for the creator ecosystem and developer platform. Thanks for joining me today, Frank.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. To start things off, it would be great if you could give us a quick insight about your role at Webflow, and for those that are unfamiliar with the company, what it does.
Webflow is a company that builds what we like to think of as a software development environment for no-code creators. So it's a visual software development environment. You could think of it as a website builder, but our ambitions are much broader than just websites into the future, right? Moving towards, beyond websites into web apps, et cetera, in the future, but really thinking about the mission of enabling anyone to create software for the web. So that's what Webflow does. As far as my role, I've been a PM at Webflow for the last 2 years, most recently stepping into a group leadership role. So building out a team of exceptional PMs focused on what we call our ecosystem, which you had as part of the introduction, but just to reiterate, is thinking about how we can really create an economy of creators on top of Webflow, using Webflow to create for each other, selling things like templates, design assets, et cetera, design systems to other builders and other no-code builders, as well as thinking about how third-party developers can really extend the core experience of Webflow and fill in all those use case gaps that we're never going to be able to get to ourselves, and really create an amazing experience for our customers.
That's fantastic. And tell us a little bit about what you're doing and your team in terms of how many PMs you're working with today.
Yeah, so currently working with 3 PMs, looking to hire a few more as well. But these PMs focus on different areas of the product, whether it's the core product, thinking of our content management system, which is what a lot of people think of as like the core piece of Webflow. Some upcoming feature launches that'll be coming out later this year. As well as what I just talked about, thinking about our ecosystem, what are different ways that we can enable no-code creators to really kind of find products and services really targeted towards Webflow. And then again, how can third-party developers actually extend Webflow via APIs, SDKs, that sort of thing.
That's a really great segue, understanding, this ecosystem and how your team is growing. As we get into this topic around product sense today, one of the definitions that we've heard is around pattern matching and being able to understand how to take in data sets together. Can you talk a little bit about how you look for those skills and how you nurture them across your teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you think of like product sense or intuition, right, I think it's actually a really important component of how um, leaders in product development can come to decisions on what to do, right, and what to unblock. I think at the best case, it's a deeply informed, educated guess when you think of intuition. And at the worst case, it's just straight up unchecked assumptions, right? And so in terms of, to your question now, how do you kind of look for that? To me, it's all about uncovering the assumptions, right? At any stage of product development, especially in the beginning, where taking a wrong assumption early on that is not built into a process of validation or checking in can have larger and compounding impact later on down the line. And so, especially when talking about, let's say, earlier career product managers, it's thinking about, what processes and ways can you encourage them to think more about their assumptions, and illustrating and being explicit about them and finding ways to kind of de-risk them, right? And tactically, those can look like things like templates, for instance, when you're at different stages of the product development cycle. It's actually something we're looking at right now at Webflow as we continue to grow out our headcount across product, and thinking about how do we elevate the product management practice and really standardize it, and really ensure that every PM can be following best practices, right? And it looks a lot like that, really thinking at a meta level of our process, and where certain types of assumptions might creep in, and figuring out ways for empowering teams, not just PMs, but also other members of the team to really be explicit about that. So that's the way kind of I think about it.
You've had a history of both working in B2B and B2C. Do you differentiate about how you think about how fast product sense can go, what kinds of bet sizes you can make based on the relative amount of information you have? How do you view that?
Yeah, so I would say that I don't have a ton of B2C experience. I do know that Webflow has a little bit of a B2C angle to it with our, especially lower end of the market. Um, so I would say that my answer is primarily B2B. But in terms of thinking about which bets you can really, take larger risks on, I think a lot of it's going to come down to how strong is your perspective on, the market, the customer, and the product that you're building, right? I think that the stronger your perspective is on each of those, especially if it's been validated through, a little bit time tested, right? Where you've had a few reps. So, for instance, not a brand new PM in a brand new market or with a brand new customer segment or with a brand new product, but if you've, been doing it for a while in a certain area, I think you can leverage that a bit more, right? And I think that speaks to the idea of pattern matching. Um, so for instance, to give you an example where I've kind of leveraged it a lot and really kind of leaned in on intuition is um, within Webflow and broadly speaking, the visual design space. There's a huge, you're creating a canvas for creativity. And creativity by definition, especially visual creativity, like visual layouts and designs and styling, there are a lot of permutations and a lot of ways that people, in many ways, you don't want to bound your customer. You want your customer to be able to build whatever they can imagine. And so naturally, there's a huge long tail of use cases and edge cases that customers will try to do or try to build that you won't be able to necessarily, that will look like isolated cases. And if you have this strong perspective, and in this case, in terms of, what is the kind of overarching product strategy, what's the experience you want to deliver, and knowing how our customers actually use our product, you can look at the commonalities across these disparate use cases, and really kind of come up with, abstractions or feature abstraction building blocks that cover many of them, right? Without necessarily just solving point examples. And this is a paradigm that you want to use anywhere in product management, right? You don't want to solve just one customer's problem. You want to generalize it. I think it's particularly salient though and important when you're talking about this visual design aspect, right? And so I'll give you an example, like thinking about, customers want to build menus or navigation bars or education curriculums, right? And they want to create experiences around that on their website. Thinking about the commonalities and realizing is like, oh, as I was thinking through this, oh, this is really just visualizing kind of like structured relational data. Courses have classes, breakfast and lunch and dinner may have different meals associated with them, et cetera, and creating an abstraction that enables customers to kind of, visualize those relationships in the data is what we ended up shipping with. And there are many ways that you can solve these different problems, but, really kind of leaning in on the intuition of like how customers have solved it, maybe if they were coding it themselves or in other systems, and kind of looking at the commonalities behind it. That's where I find you can really lean into it, specifically because you can also quickly validate this, right? This is something that you can build a prototype around and get quick feedback around. Where you don't want to take big risks. And an example where it's kind of fallen apart for me has been in the past, making the wrong decision on the tech stack, where we had a bunch of assumptions on what would be important in a tech stack, but we never really validated them. We thought that in this case, we thought that the visual polish and how well like the UI could be kind of crisply designed and implemented, we thought that that was the important piece, but we forgot to think about what was our release cadence. How would we integrate with testing? How would our designers integrate with it, right? And we actually ended up choosing a tech stack that at the beginning seemed like a really great choice, but we didn't do any work to really kind of de-risk that or evaluate those assumptions. And in the end, we ended up spending like 2 years of really painful product and slow product development because of those decisions in the tech stack early on. And again, it was just about not really being explicit about the assumptions we're going in with and what was important and how to de-risk them.
I mean, what a great example of how a product team can influence, or in this case, not have maybe given all the influence and information. Can you talk a little bit more about that example? Because I find that so interesting. You know, you made a couple assumptions, and I suspect there's a lot of PMs that may be virtually nodding their head listening to this saying, yeah, we were thinking that this would be something very user friendly and great to do, but then the tech stack goes in a completely different direction. What would you have done differently? How would you have worked internally in your organization, and how would you have worked with your customers? Because validating your tech stack, it's not like you're validating just a simple design and user testing it on a website and saying, hey, tell me what you think of this flow. What would you have done differently going back in time?
Yeah, in this case, a large challenge was many many of the engineering leaders were coming that were a part of this decision process was they were coming from like gaming as a background. We ended up choosing like a gaming engine basically as kind of a rendering environment for the UI. And it was very clear that games obviously can create very amazing UIs and graphics and all that stuff. But what we didn't really think through was, that like again, the product development process we were going to go through. And so coming back to that point and putting myself back in that position from a product perspective, I think we can really illustrate kind of two key points. Um, Number one, what are the customer outcomes we're really striving to enable? With whatever tech stack we use, it should be a means to an end, right? Um, People don't buy the tech stack, they're buying the product and the experiences we create for them. So going through those kind of creating a few hero use cases of what we're really trying to illustrate and enable with the grand vision, and really challenging the team to understand whether this tech stack versus another tech stack really, are we really blocked by going with something a little bit more manageable or more flexible? So that's number one, really bringing that kind of customer context. Number two, and this is, you could think of it as business context, but I would think of it a little bit more operational, just like the operations of product development, and thinking through how quickly of a release and iteration cycle do we really want? What expertise do we have on the team? And how do we bring in, other cross-functional members like product design or QA into this kind of development process? Kind of illustrating that out, thinking of that as kind of a little bit of a life cycle, I think would have helped out a lot. We would have found that actually, hey, there's a high barrier to entrance for gaming engines for designers, right? As opposed to, let's say, a web engine or something like that, right? Where maybe more designers know HTML, a little bit of JavaScript, and a little bit of CSS, and they can actually create mockups that can be imported more easily or whatever it is, right? Just illustrating what those processes might look like would have been much more effective. And admittedly, this was my first PM role, so I didn't see any of that. I completely deferred to the engineering team on that one. But I think you can definitely still not be an engineer and have those key inputs and bring that kind of business and customer perspective.
It really does speak to the tie between product and engineering leadership at that level to understand how the tech stack, like you said, is in service of the customer, right? It has to be towards an outcome of a goal. I think that's such a great takeaway from what you said. And, there was an example you'd given in the pre-interview around how you were also in a new role and new product, new market, etc. But you also had followed in the footsteps of the prior product roadmap. I'd love to, I'd love for you to take us through that story and what happened there.
Yeah, so like you said, I jumped into a new role, and at the moment, the product was in a position where we were ready to take on kind of new initiatives. and the macro culture was definitely biased towards execution and delivery, right? Um, and so I inherited a roadmap that was, definitely thought out and researched and various levels, but I was coming up to speed on everything, right? The market, like you said, the customer, the various customer segments, the product itself. Um, and in an environment where execution is really, is something that's really incentivized, I kind of went with the existing roadmap, next roadmap items without necessarily questioning them. And I think, in retrospect, that was good and bad. So it was definitely good in that the um, the choices that we chose and went down, I think definitely taught us a lot about our our development as a team. Also taught us a lot about, the kind of the extent and limits of our product that'll inform future roadmap items. But I'm not necessarily convinced it was the best use of that amount of time that we had now in retrospect, right? Knowing a little bit more in hindsight is 2020. But thinking about that kind of situation, generally speaking, I think it's a common situation, right? Where you're a new PM and you're coming in and it's like, all right, we got to do stuff. There's already existing thinking. Do I just use it? I think in some cases it's okay if you're able to, know, quickly leverage someone else who, the member of the team that I took the project from or the product area from was still on board. So there was a lot of, interaction with them. But being able to use some first principles thinking, I think is important. The depth of that, I think, is where it can be variable. And when I say first principles thinking, I mean to say like doing your own research, thinking about the key motivators and drivers of, the key outcomes for the product that you're owning, and then kind of backing out from those use cases that are important that drive those, those drivers or those levers, and then coming up with like, a plan or based off of that. But that can take time. That can take weeks, if not months, especially if you're onboarding to a brand new space, right? And so I think that's where some a little bit of the intuition comes in. That's where you're talking to other members of the team. That's where maybe you're leveraging more of your engineering lead or design lead who may have more shared context getting up to this point. But it's a bit of a gut call, right? I do think that I have noticed and now come to expect more senior PMs that come into roles. Just keep the, keep the train going in a sense without starting something brand new, and always delve into brand new kind of first principles research and perspectives themselves, because it is something that I do much more now as well. Because what you don't want to fall into is the trap of the assumptions and or momentum of what somebody else was driving, and not, having blind spots associated with that, right? And just continuing to potentially, optimize in an area that is lower than where, you could actually take the product if you took a step back and thought more holistically, right? And that's actually something that I do probably every 6 months or so for anything that I own, even kind of taking a step back from what I had planned out, and saying, all right, now with the full view of the world and everything we've learned a little bit more globally, what would it change, right? I think that's always important to do. But yeah.
I love that. Those are great. One of the things that just recently we happened in our company is we hired a VP of product, and
Mm.
we have a bunch of stuff lined up, and I said, I'm not here to tell you to build these things. I'm here to actually do the exact opposite. I'm here for you to challenge everything and our assumptions, because you have a fresh set of eyes, and to carve out a pathway and a strategy that makes sense. And what that does is it immediately gets him in first principles right away, and knows that I'm not beholden to, I may have strong opinions held loosely, but that's all they are at this point, and it's based on what the team has done. And so it immediately sets the cultural environment for that to happen, which I think is a great way to create momentum. But I thought that would be
For
worth sharing
sure.
as well.
And critical for someone like in a VP product role, right? I think, it's even less important necessarily that they come up with the conclusions themselves, I guess, depending on the scale of the company, but generally speaking, less important that they themselves are the person coming up with the conclusion. But creating that environment is so important, right? For the rest of the team to be able to kind of take that approach and be okay with questioning the status quo and be okay with questioning, what we've always thought we were going to do, I think is super important, especially at that altitude.
100%. And a question for you that's just dovetailing off of that. Do you, as a product group, have product principles or values that the team operates to help facilitate sort of that environment of discussion, disagreement in a healthy way?
I would say that not necessarily as a product group, we're still fairly small as a product like management team. I would say that we Webflow definitely spend a lot of time at the executive level thinking about our what we call our core behaviors. And I know that every company has some flavor of this. We call them behaviors because principles are kind of theoretical, conceptual. Behaviors are things that you can see people actually doing and exemplifying. But I would say that we definitely spend a lot of time on those. We actually just revamped them pretty recently. Actually taking them from, I think we had like 7 down to like 4 or 5, always kind of refining. And realizing that as we, I think a critical piece that I'm observing is that, we're realizing that as the company scales, the needs and types of behaviors we want to incentivize may actually change over time, especially as we bring on new people, right? Growing at the rate that we're growing, in a year and a half, 2 years, half the company may have been only here for that last year, right? And so we're definitely very critical and thoughtful about the company level ones, but I know at a product level we don't have that. We definitely, as far as like how we think about product strategy, we have quite a few kind of foundations that we're definitely trying to kind of standardize across the organization. And I think that's becoming very, very helpful. It's actually really exciting to see people like think of novel strategy and novel plans within the framing that we came up together as a group. It's really exciting to see that work out and stress test.
Can you share an example of what one of those would look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't share too many details, but I would say that one historical challenge for us has been thinking about where do we invest, right? Where do we invest our time in terms of product development? Webflow is a very horizontal product, meaning, our mission is empower anyone to build anything or any sort of web software any sort of software for the web. So it's like, okay, cool. Any sort of software. How do you segment down any sort of software? And cool. When you say anyone, how do you segment anyone, right? And trying to kind of move from where we are to where we want to be, and how are we intentional about that, and how do we apply different levers in different places, whether it's product levers or marketing levers, et cetera, community levers. So it looks a little bit like that. Think of it as kind of a map. It's very visual, or very visual and written artifact strong like company. And so we have like a lot of documents that kind of visually lay it out, and for different products show where they're individually strong, whether it's in different customer segments or different types of web software, and where do they want to go, and kind of visually bringing the company along with that, with consistent imagery and consistent nomenclature, which is really strong and reinforces kind of these principles.
So you've called PMs acting as a middle point in a spider web that keeps everything together. Can you talk a little bit about why you use that analogy? Because I think I kind of get what you're saying, but that analogy is really cool. So maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way it was framed to me was, quickly, how would you kind of visualize the role of a product manager? And I said a spider web because, like the center point of a spider web, just because, I think that there's a lot of times when people talk about the role of a product manager, they tend to use the analogy of like, all right, well, there's user experience and there's like business context, and then there's engineering, and then in the middle of that Venn diagram, that's where you are. And I actually think that spider webs are a little bit better metaphor for me. There's actually, in a really high functioning organization, I think that there are many more touch points beyond those, right? having a bit of an ear to the ground with customer support and sales and actually self-serve data and being, you know, a strong link yourself to what the underlying quantitative data is saying, the customer, in addition to the engineering design teams. And I just think that, spiderweb in that metaphor can flex and move around. And has different stressors at different times, and so it moves around the center point of the spider web may move around, based on the stressors that are currently feeling. But the PM is really kind of keeping that all together and being that kind of central point of context and why and what are we doing. I think a related piece to that is, and I think it breaks a little bit with this metaphor, but I do think of the PM role. If you don't have a PM on your team, people are going to do aspects of the role, right? They're going to fill in for you. It's just a matter of how well they do it and how much of a need there is for that to be specialized. But I do find that in very, very high functioning teams that have the space for a PM to kind of specialize all of that kind of ownership, holding everyone together and making sure that we're all rowing in the same way, I think is the way that I kind of visualize it in my mind.
That's awesome. You said that PMs need to find their superpowers. What do you mean by this, and what superpowers do you feel like you might have?
Yeah, I came up with this concept a while ago because I get a lot of people reaching out to me when they're trying to move into product management from some other kind of competency or discipline. And so a little bit of background on me, I actually did that. I started my career in engineering, did that for quite a few years, and then decided that engineering was not for me. Product management is what I wanted to do, and then I had to find a product management role, right? Um, and it's very difficult to do. Anybody that's done that transition, if it's not internal, it's very difficult to do. Even internally, it can be difficult to do. And in those cases, what I recommend to people is finding out what your superpower is, right? What is it about your background that you can really leverage and kind of position yourself for, um, whether it's company type or technology type or stage of company, where your background is going to be uniquely suited, paired with being a PM to really help enable that company reach its goals. And so, as an example of that, um, you know, I think of my superpowers as communication, especially asynchronous communication and written communication, as well as a technical bias. So, having been an engineer, I know that generally speaking, on every development team, PMs are going to be generally technical relative to the regular population, but you also have some PMs that like are okay, they're definitely technical. They were engineers themselves. Um, and so on the technical bias piece, that was actually how I got my foot in the door of my first PM job. So my first PM job was at a company called Zoox, later acquired by Amazon, but at the time was a very small startup in Menlo Park, California. Um, and I was coming out of my MBA at Stanford, trying to get my foot in the door in product management. And it turned out that I really positioned myself as, having that really large kind of technical bias and really kind of a systems thinker because of that, because of the engineering background. And it turned out that Zoox, which was a self-driving car company, um, that at that phase of development they were at, a lot of the challenges that they had were really kind of getting the foundational architecture for the hardware and systems integration and software and operations kind of working together. So it was a lot of very complex systems problems where not many PMs could come in and really kind of reconcile that, right? And so it turned out that my background was a really good fit for that. And the way that I communicated that and the way that I structured everything from my resume to our interviews was leaning on that background, right? And I think that for many people, that's a way to kind of, if they're moving from an education-based role into product management, et cetera, right? Like your superpower may be the education market, right? So focusing on startups that have an education bias or want to move into an education market, as an example, right? Like can really set you up to be differentiated as because realistically for any PM role, you're going up against other people that may have been PMs already. And so you have to really show what that superpower is and get that across concisely and quickly, right? Is very important. And so that's why I talk a little bit about that as, an important thing for people to really identify about themselves.
Do you also think for people that are inside of your team right now that you help make sure that they know what their superpower is and then how to leverage that in terms of maybe some of the projects or disciplines that they focus on outside of the traditional PM functions that they would be doing?
Yeah, I actually haven't necessarily talked about this explicitly with my teams, but it's definitely something that is top of mind that I'll be kind of working to bring out. I think one way to work through this too, right, is as some members of my team are very new to working with me, and so in my own observation and understanding of how they work, right, and organically is kind of seeing where they're really strong, giving that feedback and hoping to reinforce those behaviors. I think that's one piece, and I think something that I personally even struggle with sometimes is giving feedback when things are critical or in areas for growth or improvement are a little bit clearer and potentially more natural for people, but also making sure you're giving that feedback when things are amazing or people are really kind of going beyond or differentiating themselves. I think it's really critical as well to continue, building that behavior and showing that that's actually something that's really positive that you want to see more of, right? Um,
That's awesome. Uh, I want to just switch gears for this last question here because I think you've done a great job covering so much of the topic today, and the insights have been incredibly valuable. I know this may have been a long time ago, but in college you were an intern for the NSA. Did you have a different career path in mind at that age?
oh man. Yeah, I didn't know what I wanted to do, to be honest with you. I did, I spent a few years interning with them, got pretty deep into kind of the crypto security. This was before like cryptocurrency and all that stuff. I think that if I had done that then, maybe I would have a different career now. That's a little bit more applicable. But ultimately I didn't end up like working for the government that much. I also didn't like the one thing that actually got me was uh, when you work in those places, they're secure environments, and so there are laboratories that you work in with no windows, right, for various reasons. I was just like, man, I need to have sunlight. I need to be able to go outside. I need to be able to work on a laptop, and so I think that's what really sold it for me. And now it's like complete 180. Remote first company, working from anywhere. COVID, I think, made it for everyone that they can do that. But yeah, definitely
It
180.
sounds like you had great career sense and then evolved it into great product sense.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll see. The career sense, I think, is still a story that we have to see how it unfolds.
Absolutely. Frank, thank you so much for joining me on Product to Product today.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.